Okay, last time we met, folks, we were talking about the key battles of the Civil War. We talked about the Battle of Bull Run, and this was important because this was, who lost? The North or the Union lost, and this was bad because they realized that this war was going to take longer than they expected. And it was bad because the South also got overconfident. They thought that they were invincible, and is that always a dangerous thing, to think you're invincible? Never good. Then we got the Anaconda Plan, which is a pretty good plan. And the idea behind the Anaconda Plan was 3 or 4-fold. What was the first step of the Anaconda Plan? To establish what? A blockade. And the idea of the blockade was to prevent what?
Trade.
The South from trading. Does the South need a trade?
Yes.
Why does the South need to trade? All they have is cotton, and so they need food, guns, supplies, whatever else. Here's the northern-southern border. What was the second step of the Anaconda Plan? Yeah, yeah, capture the Mississippi River. Okay, why were they going to do that?
Because Texas holds their food.
Yeah, because all their food is here, and they're splitting them in half. What's the third step? Sherman's march to the sea and divide and conquer, and then divide and conquer again. So again, is it a pretty good plan? Yeah, because if you're living here, let's say in Alabama, can North Carolina come and help you?
Nope.
No, because they've divided the military lines. And so the Anaconda Plan, which is a northern plan to destroy the South, was a really good plan, actually. It took time to execute, but again, not a bad plan. Let's move on. This brings us to the Battle of Antietam. Next main battle. The Battle of Antietam. The Battle of Antietam is the first major Northern victory. It's the first major Northern or Union victory. And the reason why the Battle of Antietam is so significant is two things. One, it prevented England and France from supporting the South. It prevented England and France from supporting the South. So the first part of the Battle of Antietam, and the reason why it's important, is that after the North won, it convinced England and France to not support the South. Despite the English people not buying cotton anymore, there was still some, I guess, push in England and France to still support the South to weaken the Americas. And so after the North won the Battle of Antietam, the English and French said, oh, well, maybe we shouldn't help the South. I think they're going to lose the war anyway. So it prevented England and France from joining the South. The other reason why the Battle of Antietam is important is that it gave Lincoln the victory he needed. It gave Lincoln the victory he needed. It gave Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. It gave Lincoln the victory he needed to issue the Emancipation Proclamation. Who can think back and tell me what the Emancipation Proclamation did? What did it do as far as you guys can remember from 8th grade? It freed the slaves or something along those lines, right? It freed the slaves. So why couldn't Lincoln free the slaves while they were losing the war? It's not that we weren't strong enough to free them. That's part of it. But really, folks, if we're losing the war, so Lincoln says, I know what we'll do. We'll free the slaves. That'll help. Does it look desperate? That we're losing the war, so our last chance to win the war is to free the slaves. It makes us look desperate. But if we free the slaves while we're winning, does it look desperate? It looks like the icing on the cake. Like, hey, we won, and let's free the slaves too. So it doesn't make us look desperate. It makes us look strong. It makes us look like we're capable of doing such a thing. Versus doing it the other way. If we freed the slaves while we were losing, we'd look desperate. So that's kind of what's happening, and we'll talk about this in a second. But by the way, folks, the Battle of Antietam, one more thing. You don't have to write this down. But we won this battle by chance. What happened was one of General Lee's undergenerals, he left their battle plans in a cigar box on the battlefield. And so when the Union troops were marching up, they found the cigar box, they opened it, and there were Lee's formation plans for the Battle of Antietam. They said, oh, this is what they're going to do for the battle? Great. Let's go ahead and rearrange our troops so that we can accommodate all of Lee's advances, and that's how we defeated them. Because Lee had left his battle plans on the ground, we found them, and we used them against him during the war. So that's how we won the Battle of Antietam. By foolishness, really. Anyway, folks, here's what the Emancipation Proclamation actually did. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves, but only in the rebel states. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the rebel states. The Emancipation Proclamation freed the slaves in the rebel states. Now here's my question. Does Lincoln have any power in the rebel states? Does he have any control over the Confederacy? Can he say, hey, you in rebellion, you have to free your slaves now? Are they going to listen to him? No. So how many slaves did Lincoln actually free? None. And where could he have freed the slaves? North, the border states. But is he going to free the slaves in the border states? Why won't he free the slaves in the border states? He needs their support, and if he frees the slaves in the border states, what might happen? They might back out and secede. So here's the thing about the Emancipation Proclamation. It's a good phrasing I like to use, but it's where he could, he would not, and where he would, he could not. Where he could, he would not, and where he would, he could not. Yep, where he could, he would not, and where he would, he could not. Let me explain. Where he could free the slaves, where was that? The border states. Would he free the slaves in the border states? No, because they might secede. But where he would free the slaves, where was that? Rebel states. Could he free the slaves? No. So the reality is, how many slaves did Lincoln free? None. He freed no slaves with the Emancipation Proclamation. So he freed no slaves. To be fair, though, it did have the intended effect. Because by saying, hey, you're now all free, what did he hope to happen in the South? That slaves would begin running away. And so that did happen to some degree. So to an extent, it was successful. 1/7 of slaves in the South began to run away. So 1/7 of slaves in the South began to run away and join the North, which is a good thing. But truth be told, folks, when we think about Abraham Lincoln and this idea of emancipation, you have to understand his actual feelings about it. So I'm going to read a quote from Abraham Lincoln about the Emancipation Proclamation, and I'm going to call on one of you to tell me how he feels about it. Okay? So read along as I read out loud. If I could save the Union without freeing any slave, I would do it. And if I could save it by freeing all the slaves, I would do it. And if I could do it by freeing some and leaving others alone, I would also do that. So, my question is, what was Lincoln's main goal? Martin. Based on this, what is his ultimate priority? He wants to save the Union. Is it about freeing the slaves? Does he actually care about freeing the slaves? No. He said, hey, if I could save the Union and not free a single slave, would I do that? Yes. So freeing the slaves, emancipation was not his goal. It was just something he had to do to help win the war. But in truth, if he could free no slaves, would he have done that? Yeah, so keep in mind, folks, Lincoln is not the type of man who says, oh, slavery is the most horrible thing in the world, we should get rid of it. He thinks slavery is bad, don't get me wrong. But it's his first priority to get rid of slavery. His first priority is to restore the Union. So be aware of that. Huh? Lincoln never had slaves. Jackson had slaves, Martin Van Buren had slaves, all those guys. Washington, Jefferson had slaves. But Lincoln never had slaves. Lincoln was never rich. He was like middle class his entire life, or poor when he was born, became middle class, but never wealthy enough to have slaves. Also, he's from the North, in Illinois. They don't have slaves there. Anyway, so that's the Emancipation Proclamation. So the only places that had slaves, folks, the only places where we freed the slaves were here. So again, how many slaves did we free? None. Anyway, this brings us to the Battle of Gettysburg. The Battle of Gettysburg is another major Northern victory. And it's a huge battle, folks. It was 92,000 Northerners versus 76,000 Southerners. Almost 200,000 people on the battlefield. That's a lot. 76,000 Southerners. It's a Northern victory, but over 51,000 casualties. That's a lot. 51,000. That's a lot. It's a pretty important battle. It's one of the North's major victories. And can Lincoln just ignore the fact that 51,000 people died on this battlefield? No, Lincoln has to commemorate this day some way. And so what ends up happening is Lincoln decides to travel to Gettysburg on a train because he has to somehow honor these men in one way or another. And so on the train ride over, he writes over 19 drafts of what will eventually become known as the Gettysburg Address, each time changing it over and over and over again. And by the time he finally gives the Gettysburg Address, he just wings it. He doesn't even read the speech that he wrote. He kind of just does it from memory. And he doesn't go by the exact script that he spent writing 19 times. Yes?
Didn't you write like on the train there?
Huh? Yeah, he wrote it on the train right there, and he wrote 19 different drafts and didn't even stick to one of them.
Why did he
What? Because he ultimately decided that he wanted to speak naturally. And the speech was only like 4 minutes. And the interesting thing is, I'm going to read the speech to you guys in just a second. One of the newspapers in Illinois back in 1863, 1864, wrote how Lincoln's speech was nothing more than just like words that would not have any historical meaning, and it was just the president speaking without any real emotion or value. Yesterday, that newspaper retracted that story saying, yeah, we were wrong about that. Clearly, the Gettysburg Address has become one of the most important, influential speeches of our time. But when a newspaper in Illinois, in Pennsylvania, was a newspaper, and it was even called something else differently in 1865, they criticized the speech as being nothing more than just words and no value. And in 2013, they said, yeah, we clearly did not understand back in 1865 what we were talking about. So we retract our original opinion piece over 100 years old and want to state that we don't stand by that story anymore. And we actually believe that the speech was pretty good. This was yesterday that happened. They retracted the story yesterday.
Wait, literally?
Literally. This happened yesterday. I heard it on the news. I'm like, oh, that's interesting. I'm teaching about that. Anyway, the Gettysburg Address. So over a hushed crowd, Lincoln offers this speech because he has to commemorate those that died. So he reads, 407 years ago, our fathers brought forth upon this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Now we are engaged in a great civil war, testing whether that nation or any nation so conceived and so dedicated can long endure. We are met on a great battlefield of that war. We have come to dedicate a portion of that field as a final resting place for those who here gave their lives, that that nation might live. It is altogether fitting and proper that we should do this. But in a larger sense, we cannot dedicate. We cannot consecrate. We cannot hallow this ground. The brave men living and dead who struggled here have consecrated it far above our power to add or detract. The world will little note nor long remember what we say here. but it can never forget what they did here. It is for us, the living rather, to be dedicated here to the unfinished work which they who fought here have thus far so nobly advanced. It is rather for us to be here dedicated to the great task remaining before us. That from these honored dead we take increased devotion to that cause for which they gave the last full measure of devotion. That we here highly resolve that these dead shall not have died in vain. That this new nation, under God, shall have a new birth of freedom. And that government of the people, by the people, for the people, shall not perish from this earth. It's a pretty good speech. And the argument that he's ultimately making is that this government was made 77 years ago, and that we refuse to let what we stand for be run into the ground. That these men that died here today, what were we not going to let happen? We're not going to let them die in vain. They had to have died for something. So what are we going to have to do? We're going to have to win. We're going to have to win this war, because otherwise these men died for nothing. We have to honor those men. We have to win. Because if not, then what the hell was this all for? Why did these men have to die? That's the Gettysburg Address. It's a good speech. He winged it. Impressive. Yes. Scores 20 years. So 80 years plus 7, so 87 years ago. What are they talking about? 7 years ago. 1776 Declaration of Independence. When our country was first founded, 7 years ago, our founders brought forth on this continent a new nation, conceived in liberty and dedicated to the proposition that all men are created equal. Well, after that, we have Sherman's March to the Sea. This is again the North. We don't talk about the South. General Sherman begins his march to the sea. And in his march to the sea, folks, what General Sherman does is he practices what is known as Shermanizing. And it's also known as scorched earth policy. Napoleon did this too. Scorched earth policy, or Shermanizing, meant that Sherman was going to burn everything to the ground. As he marched through the South, he literally burned everything to the ground. Him and his 60,000 troops burned crops, homes, bridges, towns, villages, roads, tracks, anything. He would destroy everything and burn it all to the ground. And he did it on purpose. Because his goal, folks, was to demoralize the South. His whole point was to demoralize the South. Because the idea was, you soldiers, you Confederate soldiers that are off fighting on the battle lines, well, you can keep fighting. But while you're there, I'm going to burn down your home. I'm going to destroy your crops. I'm going to destroy everything that you love. So keep fighting. But while you're there, I'm here. And I'm destroying everything. By the way, he didn't kill women or children or anything like that. But he burned down all of the goods, necessities, roads, infrastructure, everything. What was he hoping to happen? By doing all of this, what was his hope?
To break their spirits.
Yeah, to break their spirits. And hopefully, what was he hoping these men would do?
Surrender.
Not surrender. Go home. He was hoping, what do we call that, folks? When you're in part of the army and then you go home.
Desert?
He was hoping for desertion. That these soldiers would desert the army and go home to protect their homes. And by hoping for mass desertion, he was hoping to end the war quickly. By having mass desertion, he was hoping to end the war quickly. Because fewer troops, is the South going to be able to keep fighting? No. So he said, hey, keep fighting if you want. I'm destroying everything that you love. Your choice. You really want to keep fighting for slavery? or do you want your house back? So, Shermanization destroyed roads, bridges, factories, whatever he could. Here he is, folks. He started from Atlanta and burned everything to the ground. Then he went north and did it again. So, yeah, just raising crops in his wake. This is known, folks, as total war. Because in war, folks, if I'm a soldier, is it shocking if I die? No, that happens. It's war. But in total war, who else is affected? Everyone else is affected. So Sherman decides to fight a total war. We're not just going to attack the soldiers anymore. We're going to attack your homes, your bridges, your livelihoods, your farms. We're going to burn everything until you decide to stop fighting. So it becomes total war. I mean, this is Charleston. We burn it. I mean, this is Atlanta. No, sorry. This is Savannah. And you see, he's just setting the city on fire. On purpose. Not by accident. So, Lincoln is reelected in the election of 1864. Lincoln gets reelected because they're still fighting a war and he needs to keep fighting it. Why didn't the South vote in this election? They're still in secession. So, Lincoln fights this war. And actually, Lincoln, when he gets elected, he's elected as part of the Union Party. And the Union Party was a combination of Republicans and war Democrats. So the two parties merged to continue fighting this war. And the Union Party was a combination of Republicans and war Democrats. Combination of Republicans and war Democrats. So Lincoln, the president, was a Republican, but his vice president, Andrew Johnson, was what? He was a Democrat. But they merged because they had a common goal in this election. It happens from time to time, folks. You have like a conservative Democrat and a progressive Democrat. Rarely does it happen today because, local parties are stupid. But it happens from time to time. So the South is losing, and the South says, hey, what if we sign a Southern peace treaty? Huh? Sign a peace treaty? What does Lincoln say? No peace, only surrender. Because a peace suggests what? The South gets to remain, right? So he said, no peace, only surrender. Because the South wanted to end the war, but did they want to stay independent? Lincoln said, yeah, that's not an option. No peace, only surrender. It would have been worse if he said no peace, no surrender, and said, not only are we not going to accept your peace, but we're going to kill everyone. If Andrew Jackson was president during the Civil War, this would be a very different end. He would have murdered everyone. But no peace, only surrender. The war finally ends at the Battle of Appomattox. At the Battle of Appomattox Courthouse, where General Lee from the South surrenders to General Grant of the North. So the war ends when General Lee surrenders to General Grant. The Battle of Appomattox, and then they sign the treaty or the surrender at the courthouse. It's kind of interesting when you wonder, how does a surrender work out? You're killing each other and then you just kind of end? And so I found 3 correspondences between Lee and Grant going back and forth, trying to negotiate the surrender, what it sounded like. It sounds more cordial and formal than you would expect from a we surrender. It's not just like a white flag. It's a lot like this. So here's letter to General Lee. This is General Lee. The results of last week must convince you of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia in this struggle. I feel that it is so, and regard it as my duty to shift from myself the responsibility of any further effusion of blood by asking of you the surrender of that portion of the Confederate States Army known as the Army of Northern Virginia. Very respectfully, your obedient servant, U.S. Grant. General Lee responds,
General U.S. Grant. General, I have received your note of this date. Though not entertaining the opinion you express of the hopelessness of further resistance on the part of the Army of Northern Virginia, I reciprocate your desire to avoid useless effusion of blood, and therefore, before considering your proposition, ask the terms you will offer on condition of its surrender. Commanding General of the Confederate States of America, Robert E. Lee. General Grant responds, to General Robert E. Your note of last evening just received. In reply, I would say that there is but one condition I would insist upon, namely that the men and officers surrendered shall be disqualified for taking up arms against the government of the United States. I will meet you at any point agreeable to you for the purpose of arranging definitely the terms upon which the surrender of the Army of Northern Virginia will be received. General U.S. Grant. That's how it worked. Just went back and forth. These very, very formal letters. Eventually, they surrender, and that's the end of the Civil War. Civil War ends in April 1865. Everyone's pretty happy about it. 1865, April 1865, Civil War ends, but the death toll is pretty staggering. Battle deaths 110,000, but the total deaths 250,000. Here's the North, here's the South. April 1865 is when the war ended, but then again, the battle deaths and the total deaths are pretty staggering. The North lost the more. Why? They had more people, but also what kind of war are they fighting? They're fighting an offensive war, whereas the South, all they had to do was hide in their houses, right? If they really wanted to, just stand behind a wall and just let them come to you. They could hide the entire time. But the North, they had to keep advancing into the South. And so the North definitely lost more people. And they just had more people. So to consider a loss from the North, every time they lost the battle, they lost more men than the South did, just because of numbers. Okay. I'll go back. And looking at the numbers, folks, here's the Civil War. The numbers are so staggering, folks, because for every bullet that was fired, it went into another American. And so we killed each other during this war. So the enemy was us. We were the enemy. And so, of course, for every loss, it was an American life. Whereas in World War II, even though the death toll was upwards of like 10 million, that included Germans, French, Russians, whatever else. Whereas the Civil War was just us. And so the numbers are quite staggering when you compare it. Up until recently, the Civil War had more deaths than all the other wars combined. But because of the growing death toll of the Iraq-Afghanistan wars, the death toll has now superseded the Civil War. Not that the Iraq-Afghanistan war has caused more deaths than the Civil War, but before we could say all the other wars combined were less than the Civil War, that's not true anymore. But still, a lot of deaths. Let's talk about the fall of Lincoln. No one was happier than Abraham Lincoln to have this war end. Because, folks, did Lincoln want this war? No, Lincoln did not want this war at all. This war was thrust upon him. He became president, the South seceded, and that was it. And it was a war that he inherited but never wanted. So I want you to really look quickly. I'm going to show you guys images of Lincoln through the 5 years of his presidency. And I want you to notice something about him and the toll it took on him physically and mentally. So here's Lincoln in 1860. 1861. 3. 64. 65. In 5 years, Lincoln aged almost 20. But you have to understand why, folks. Lincoln inherited a war that he never wanted. Several sleepless nights. This war was bearing down on his shoulders. Can you imagine? Every day he would receive telegrams in the mail. 300 more dead. 1,000 dead. 4,000 dead. 300 dead.
And he has to grapple with that task of how am I going to end this war and save these innocent lives? And yet no matter what he does, this war continues. And every day he has to grapple with the thought that all those men are dying and he's responsible for sending them to their deaths. He's responsible for that. Not anyone else. He bears that burden. And the entire time, he has no respect from the American public. Abolitionists say, Lincoln, you're not doing enough. Why don't you free the slaves? You're useless as a president. You're doing a terrible job. The slaves aren't even free. You suck at this. You are terrible. Do your job. And yet, Democrats on the opposite side who oppose the war saying, Lincoln, you're tearing this country apart. You're ruining our country. You are responsible for the lives of all these men. What are you doing to end this war, Lincoln? What are you doing? Because you're destroying this country. On both sides, no one wanted Lincoln to be president. On both sides, they criticized him and lambasted him in the newspapers, calling him a dictator, calling him, a weak president. Do something, Lincoln. Do something. And the entire time, he has the weight of the country and this war bearing down on him with no friends left or right. He also has to endure the fact that 3 of his children die while he's president. And his wife literally goes insane. She loses her mind. And yet he has no time to console his wife because he can't just focus on 3 children dead. He has to focus on the fact that hundreds of thousands of Americans are dying, and he can't draw his attention away from those men and focus on his one wife and his kids. And so for 5 years, Lincoln endures, criticized on all sides, not a friend in sight, his wife losing her mind to depression. And so after 5 years, the war is over, and Lincoln can finally breathe a sigh of relief. That the war is over, Lincoln can finally smile again. So he decides ultimately to take his wife out to go watch a play. He takes his wife out to watch My American Cousin, and he's happy for the first time in a long time. He's holding Mary Todd so tightly because he knows he hasn't been there for her in the last 5 years. She says to him and remarks, Mr. Lincoln, what will people think of you holding me so tightly? And President Lincoln said, oh, they won't think of it. They won't think anything of it. And he smiles for the first time in 5 years, a genuine smile. They walk up into their booth, and then My American Cousin starts playing. It's a comedy of sorts, and they laugh, and Lincoln's having a good time. He's genuinely excited, happy, pleased. And at the moment of the play, where one of the stage persons tell a joke, the entire audience roars up into laughter. And at that point, Wilkes Booth rushes into Lincoln's balcony. John Wilkes Booth was an actor. He was very familiar with My American Cousin, but he was also a Southerner who hated what Lincoln did to the South. So once the audience roars up in laughter, he kicks open the balcony door, takes his gun, and fires his gun directly into Lincoln's head. Lincoln never wakes up again. He stabs the colonel right next to Lincoln in the chest, and then knowing that more soldiers are running into the balcony, he jumps off the balcony and lands right on the stage. He breaks his leg. He takes a bow in front of the audience and runs off stage. The entire audience does not know what's happening. They think it's part of the act, and they continue laughing. But as the audience starts dying down in their laughter, all you can hear in that audience, in that theater, is the screams and cries of Mary Todd Lincoln, shouting that her husband's been shot. They take President Lincoln across the street to the inn, at which point he lives for 9 hours more and then dies. Lincoln gave his life for this country, restored the country from when it was broken. Not a moment in those 5 years could Lincoln genuinely say that he was happy without the burden of the war on his shoulders. The thanks that he got for that was criticism from the media, criticism from abolitionists and more Democrats. And once the war was over, he didn't even have a chance to appreciate what he'd just done, because 9 days after that war ended, he was shot.
John Wilkes Booth escaped for 6 days, but a reward was put out, a $100,000 reward, dead or alive. 6 days later, John Wilkes Booth was found in a warehouse. The Union soldiers killed him. It turned out that he was actually part of a larger plot. 8 Southern conspirators were actually a part of this conspiracy to assassinate Lincoln. Among them was Mary Surratt, a woman who owned an inn near Washington, D.C., and at her inn is where they planned this conspiracy to kill Lincoln. They were captured, they were put to the gallows, and they were hung for treason. President Lincoln was paraded through the town in this funeral procession across, I believe, 12 states, or 12 cities, rather. From D.C. all the way through the north, and eventually they ended in Springfield. A photo was taken of Mary Todd Lincoln several weeks or months after Lincoln was killed. And as you can see, you see the ghost of Lincoln. That's not an actual ghost. This is like Photoshop of the 1860s and 70s. They would superimpose a photo on another photo. It's a double exposure. So they take another photo and superimpose it on. So that's kind of how they did these kind of photos. You have to understand, folks, that Mary Todd Lincoln was already crazy by this time. She already started doing seances and going to media to speak to her dead children. And so she did the same thing with her husband after he died and believed that after they passed, she could still communicate with them because really, she had no one except Robert Todd Lincoln left. All her other children had been killed, died, whatever else. President Lincoln was eventually taken to Springfield, Illinois. He was placed in his monument. This is Lincoln's monument. It's the bust of Lincoln. His nose is really shiny because it's rumored that if you rub its nose, it's good luck. Some people like rubbing its nose. I did. And here lies Abraham Lincoln, 1809 to 1865, inside that monument. He's in there. Body entombed in the monument in Springfield, Illinois, the town he grew up in, where he forever resides. Yes? I believe that, all his family is buried in Springfield, Illinois. But I think the idea was that his family might be buried locally in that area, but he himself received a monument to kind of announce that fact. That's the end of the Civil War. Now, we're going to go ahead and start the last part of this unit. But interesting fact, folks, that most people don't know is that in one instance, one of Abraham Lincoln's children was at a train station, and he tripped at the train station into the tracks. And a train was coming, and the child was about to die. Luckily, a complete bystander, not unknown to this child, jumped into the train tracks, grabbed the child, pulled him out, and saved his life. That man was John Wilkes Booth's brother. So John Wilkes Booth's brother saved one Lincoln, while John Wilkes Booth killed another. Coincidence. How is that not a coincidence? Like that was planned?
I don't know.
That is a coincidence. That's by definition, that's what a coincidence is. If anything, it's a cool story. But again, folks, Lincoln, you got to feel bad for the guy. You really got to feel bad for the guy because he literally gave years off his life and ultimately even gave his life to restore the country. But yeah. He was not my favorite president until I visited the Lincoln Library in Springfield, Illinois, and there's this place called the Whispering Gallery. You walk through it. It's a hallway that kind of waves through, and it's chronological. So you walk through, and you see all these political cartoons throughout Lincoln's presidency, criticizing him back, like left on both sides, and they'll actually whisper at you through speakers about the criticisms of Lincoln. And so you walk through this gallery, and you'll see pictures of him getting older and older as you walk through. There's a scene where it's a shadow of him over a telegraph machine, and you see these numbers, 3,000 dead, 400 dead. And at the very end, and you're walking through, and you're just feeling horrible. You actually, I started tearing up because you just feel so bad for the guy. And when you finally walk through the end of the Whispering Gallery, there's this tomb. and then you walk past replica Ford's theater first at the balcony, and you see a man standing outside, and you want so badly to stop him, but you can't because they're not real. But you're like, if I could, I would. And then you walk into this last room, and it's just a monument to Lincoln and his casket there, and it's heart wrenching because you're like, oh, you feel so bad for it. If you ever have an opportunity to go, Springfield, Illinois, if you're near Chicago, stop by Springfield, Illinois, because Abraham Lincoln Library and Presidential Museum is awesome. It's quite good, and so I highly recommend if you get an opportunity. Yes?
Have you been to Disneyland?
You mean like yes, I've been to, Disneyland also has the presidential animatronic robot president, so also good. Lincoln gives the Gettysburg Address there, some other good stuff. Anyway, folks, last part of Unit 5, Reconstruction. The war's over. We've won. Now what do we have to do? We have to rebuild the country. We destroyed it pretty badly. So now we must rebuild the country. So from 1865 to 1877, this period is known as Reconstruction. 23 years until the turn of the century, folks. Yes? Huh? This is Section 3 of Unit 5. This is the last section of Unit 5. So we went from Road to the Civil War, Reconstruction. Last part. Here we go, folks. From 1877. Next unit, we go into the 1900s. Shocking. The purpose of Reconstruction is threefold. Number one, repair the damage to the South. Because was the South pretty damaged? Yeah. We destroyed it. Who destroyed it in particular? Sherman. Burned everything to the ground. So we had to fix that. The Shermanator. 2, we have to restore the southern states to the Union. And this is harder than you might think, folks. Because under what terms? Do we just say, hey, are you sorry? Yeah, I'm sorry. Okay, we'll come on back then. Is sorry good enough? I mean, what do you do with all the soldiers that fought? What about the leaders? Do you arrest them? Under what terms do we bring them back? And so that's actually a very highly controversial topic that's going to occur. Under what circumstances do you bring them back to the Union? Is sorry good enough? And lastly, folks, what do we do about freed slaves? First off, do we free them because Lincoln freed the slaves? No, so what about those that haven't been freed yet? What do you do with those slaves? So 3 important goals of Reconstruction. Address the freed slave issue, restore the southern states to the Union, repair the damage to the South. Pretty critical goals here. Good. Excuse me. Now, when Lincoln's inaugural address, you have to write this down. I just want you guys to understand what Lincoln's forethought was. Let me go back a little bit. Lincoln was alive at the beginning of Reconstruction. So this kind of overlaps the Civil War just a little bit. So it's not like Lincoln came back from the dead to do Reconstruction and died again. Reconstruction's end of the Civil War overlapped just a little bit because we already had won some states before the war was over. So Reconstruction began 1865 early. Lincoln died 4 months later. This is kind of how this works. So he said in his second inaugural address, with malice toward none. Malice means hard feelings or anger towards none. With charity for all, with firmness in the right, as God gives us to see the right, let us strive on to finish the work we are in, to bind up the nation's wounds, to do all which may achieve and cherish a just and lasting peace among ourselves and with all nations. What is his goal? What does he want? He just wants to rebuild the Union and have peace again. That's all he wants left. We have these questions of Reconstruction, and we ask ourselves, what are we going to do? 3 questions arise. The 3 questions that we have to ask are, 1, how do we guarantee Southern loyalty? How to guarantee Southern loyalty? That's question number 1. How do you guarantee Southern loyalty? Because, yeah, we bring them back to the Union, but what might happen in the future? They might secede again. So how do we make sure that doesn't happen? So, 1, how do we guarantee Southern loyalty? 2, what do we do with Confederate leaders? Do we put them in jail? Jefferson Davis, does he go to jail? Robert E. Lee, do we put him in jail? Do we forgive them? If they say sorry, it's okay? I mean, what do you do with Confederate leaders and generals? Number 3, what's the status of freed slaves? So let's say we do free them. Are they citizens now? Do they get the right to vote? Are they going to be equal to whites? Are they going to live among us? Are we going to force them back to Africa? Are we going to let them live here with us? Are we going to have segregated communities? What do we do with them? So what to do, or what's the status of freed slaves? All good questions. Lincoln thought he had an answer. So Lincoln's response was presidential reconstruction. Lincoln said, I think I know what I'll do here. And Lincoln's presidential reconstruction plan was known as the 10% plan. Whoops. Lincoln had something called the 10% plan. And the 10% plan said that if 10% of each southern state pledged an oath of loyalty if 10% of each southern state, so not 10% of the entire South, but for each individual southern state, if they pledged an oath of loyalty, the southern states pledged an oath of loyalty, they could be returned to the government. Just 10%. That's all they had to do. If 10% say, we're sorry, we promise not to do it again, then Lincoln said, okay, that's fine. And he would let them come back in. Is 10% a lot? No. Let's say you guys all decide to burn down my house. So you burn down my house, I'm angry at all of you. Like, I'm going to call the police. But I say, if 10% of you say you're sorry, then I won't call the police. So you 3 say you're sorry, and the rest of you are still laughing about it. I say, well, if they said sorry, I forgive all of you. That's what the 10% plan is. If 10% apologize, that's it. Is that good enough? No, but Lincoln did this because, in all honesty, folks, did he want to have to fight another political war? Understand, folks, Lincoln is tired. He is tired of war. He's done with the Civil War. He doesn't want to have to now fight a battle in Congress. He just says, let's let them come back. Let's end the war quickly. Let's just have a lasting peace now. Here's the other elements of his 10% plan. Not only was 10% required, but he was going to pardon all Confederate leaders. So if you were Jefferson Davis, or Alexander Stephens, or Robert E. Lee, guess what? You don't get in trouble. Under Lincoln's plan, hey, I know you're responsible for the deaths of 600,000 Americans, but just tell me you're sorry and it'll be good. You can go back to Congress. You can serve in the American military again. I mean, I know you didn't mean it. And I get it. I know why you did it. I understand it. So, just say you're sorry and you can go back as if nothing happened. Is that okay? But again, does Lincoln want to fight? No. And the last thing that Lincoln said as part of his 10% plan, here's what else I'll do. Just to make sure that Reconstruction is quick, I won't free any more slaves. He would not free the remaining slaves. So any slaves that were not freed by the end of the war, what happens to them? They stay slaves. That was his plan. If any slaves remain after the war, they will stay slaves. That is my 10% plan. 10% say sorry, I'll go ahead and pardon all the Confederate generals, and I won't free any more slaves. Done. Now, why did Lincoln want all of this again?
He's
Tired? Does he want to fight?
No.
He just wants to end the war. Pretty much, folks, this is a very conservative plan. Because what didn't he really want to do? Change things. Just keep things the way they were. Hey, you know what? Whatever. Let's keep things the way they are. If slaves are free, but let's just keep the others where they are. because he doesn't want any trouble. He just wants to restore the Union quickly. But who's not happy about this? The North. They're like, well, no. We lost 630,000 lives. You said it yourself. We can't let these men die in vain. But he said they didn't. We restored the Union. But was that good enough for the North? No. So a new group emerges called the Radical Republicans, led by Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. By the way, what do radicals want? Change. They want a lot of change. They said, no, we are not going back to the status quo. We are not going back to the way things are. We demand change. So the Radical Republicans, they controlled Congress. And they argued that Lincoln's plan was too lenient. What does that mean, to be too lenient? It was too easy, too nice. Lincoln, you're just going to forgive everyone? No, not okay. Not okay. Too lenient, Lincoln. Because is any real change going to happen after Lincoln's 10% plan? No. So I said, no, we demand real change. So Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner. Remember Charles Sumner? Got beat with a cane? That guy? He's back. He's the guy who got beat by cane? He's back. And they decide to pass their own bill. Ignore this. Called the Wade-Davis Bill. So they passed their own bill called the Wade-Davis Bill. Say, Lincoln, your plan is too weak. Here's our plan. Instead of 10%, they said 50%. Is that a lot more?
Yeah.
Yeah. It's a lot more. And they said they're going to have to give an ironclad oath. Not just a regular oath of loyalty, but an ironclad oath. Because an ironclad oath, what? Can't be broken. How it was different, I don't know. It was still someone signing a piece of paper, but they called it the ironclad oath. They also said, no pardons. No pardons. What does that mean?
You're not forgiven for it.
Yeah, you're not forgiven for your crimes, buddy. Okay, if you were responsible for this war, hell's a-coming. There will be a reckoning. Third part. What else were they going to do that Lincoln wasn't going to do? They're going to free the slaves. Because, yeah, I know Lincoln didn't say that's why the war was being fought, but many people thought that's why the war was being fought, to end slavery. They were going to free the slaves. Well, does Lincoln like this plan? So what is Lincoln going to do? He kind of vetoes it. What Lincoln does is something called the pocket veto. It's different from a regular veto. Let me explain. Yes, sir.
Is all this taking place in the different 9 days?
Not, again, this took place, we had already taken over southern states already. So Reconstruction actually began a little before the war ended. About 4 or 5 months before the war ended, Reconstruction was already started. Like, what do we do with Tennessee? What do we do with Missouri? Those kinds of states. And so, here's how bills kind of work, folks. You guys know that you pass a bill, Congress has to sign it, and then the president has to sign it, right? Yeah. Or the president can veto it. But the president can also not sign and not veto. So here's what happens, folks. It's kind of complicated. You'll learn this next year also. But if a president doesn't sign a bill, after 10 days, it automatically becomes a law. Because can the president not act on something? He has to choose. It's his job. But if the president doesn't sign a bill and Congress is in recess, the bill dies. So if, let's say, Congress gave Lincoln the bill right before winter break and Congress goes out for holiday recess, then guess what? If Lincoln doesn't sign it, the bill automatically dies. So Congress doesn't really like giving bills to the president before a holiday because they're afraid that the president is not going to sign it and the bill dies automatically. They like giving it to the president if they know they're going to be in session, so that they know the president's not going to sign it or veto it, it automatically becomes law. Because the president doesn't support it openly, but he also doesn't hate it. So he'll just let it become law, like whatever. But if he pocket vetoes it, the bill dies after 10 days. Make sense? By the way, if the president vetoes a bill, what option does Congress have? It goes back to Congress, and what can Congress do? They can override it. An override. So if the president vetoes a bill, Congress has the power to override that bill. One of the reasons why the president did not veto the bill is that Congress could have overridden the bill. But we'll talk about that later. Anyway, so Lincoln pocket vetoes the bill. So Congress says, oh yeah? Well, you know what? Here's something you have no control over. Congress decides to pass the 13th Amendment. And the 13th Amendment, what does it do? Freed the slaves. All the slaves, including slaves where? Well, yes, including those states, but also where else? Border states, especially. So it freed all the slaves, including the border states. And by the way, folks, to pass an amendment, you need Congress and the states. In fact, folks, you need 2/3 of both houses, and you need 3/4 of all states in order to pass an amendment. It's hard to do. But who's not involved in the amendment process? The president. So Congress passes the 13th Amendment, saying that that all slaves shall be free. So how many slaves did Lincoln free? 0. But people misunderstand what Lincoln did. Lincoln is the man who freed the slaves. Actually, no. He's not. He's not the man who freed the slaves. Thaddeus Stevens and Charles Sumner are the men who helped organize the freeing of slaves. They're the ones who passed this bill because was Lincoln going to free the slaves after the war? No, he wasn't going to even do it anyway. So he's not the man. He's not the great emancipator. Now, to be fair, would we have been able to do this if Lincoln did not restore the Union? No, so yeah, we needed him to fix the country. But was he content with not freeing the slaves after the war? Yeah. Here's the other thing. When this was passed by both the House, Senate, and the states, Lincoln opposed it up until that point when we realized that it was going to pass anyway. Lincoln said, oh, I support that bill too, and he signed it. But here's the thing. Congress said, hey, Lincoln, we don't need your signature because we can pass this without you. So you can keep your signature. We don't need it. But there is a copy of the 13th Amendment. It was at the Huntington Library a little while ago. With Lincoln's signature on it, but that signature was not necessary. But Lincoln wanted to jump on the bandwagon. Oh, slavery's terrible. Me too. But they're like, no, liar. We know what you were thinking. We were there. But again, people forget. It doesn't make Lincoln, I guess it kind of makes him not as nice of a person, but he still did great things, right? Restored the country, whatever else. Just know, though, he wasn't as great of an emancipator as people assume he was. It doesn't make him a terrible person. It just makes him more real. Did the man have mistakes? Sure. Great. Despite those mistakes, he still fixed our country. That's pretty good. So, consider that. Fun fact. You have to write this down? So the 13th Amendment was passed in 1865. Mississippi did not actually agree or vote on this amendment until 1995. Like, it didn't mean they could have slaves anymore, but as a state, they openly did not agree with the 13th Amendment. So in 1995, like, hey, did you know that you guys didn't agree to the 13th Amendment yet? Like, really? Oh, crap. So in 1995, they agreed to the 13th Amendment. But earlier this year, they realized, even though they agreed to it, they never officially ratified it. And so I think in February of this year, Mississippi officially ratified the 13th Amendment, saying, oh, yeah, slavery's bad. I know that that's like 150 years old now, and everyone else has moved on. But officially, we want to say we agree with that idea, that slavery is bad in this country. And it's not like they had slaves, don't get me wrong. But as a state, they didn't officially endorse the 13th Amendment until like 6 months ago.
Forget to or what?
They just forgot. I thought we did that. No, you guys never signed the 13th Amendment. Oh, we should do that. That makes us look so bad.
So what did you find out? Like, recently?
They were just going through the documents. Like, someone who works in, like, the historical records realized as they were flipping through, they were like, wait, Mississippi never signed this. Like, because the bill was there. It was just never ratified or approved. Like, oh, we should do that. So they did it. Like earlier this year. It's a stupid oversight, but it happened. So I thought that was interesting. Anyway, President Johnson replaces Abraham Lincoln after Lincoln is killed, serving from 65 to 68. Johnson is of what party? He's a Democrat. Congress is controlled by who? Republicans. And they already don't like Lincoln. They're really not going to like Johnson. He was the vice president, a Democrat at the time. Remember the Union Party? They merged the two parties for that one election. Well, Johnson is president now, and he doesn't look very happy. But for good reason. Ready? By the way, folks, the way presidential elections work, we talked about this under when Harrison was when he died. But the question that was always asked is, what is the role of the vice president? I mean, if a president dies, does the vice president just serve the remainder of his term, or does he hold office until we elect a new president for 4 years? And we didn't really know until Harrison died, and then Harrison decided, no, you serve the remainder of his term, which is why he only serves 3 years. But for a while we thought, well, maybe if a president dies, the vice president just takes his job for a little while, and then we have to elect a new president that year that will serve a new 4 years, which would have really screwed up elections, because then you don't have a consistent 4-year term. It's like when someone dies, you change it again, which would be really annoying, but it's not what happened. Anyway, here's what's happening in the South. So the South now has to deal with all these freed blacks, right? The freedmen, they're done, they're free. So the South says, well, we got to deal with these freed blacks now. So they passed the Black Codes. And the Black Codes were designed to regulate or control the freedmen. Because to be fair, folks, were these blacks used to freedom? No, most of them have been enslaved their entire lives. They thought, well, we got to deal with them somehow. We can't just let them go roaming everywhere. So we got to regulate this new population of freedmen in the South. So here are some laws. Write some of them down. So here are some of the Black Codes that were passed at this time. Number 1, blacks can't own land in some states. 2, blacks may not be out after dark. Blacks can't be out after dark. Blacks can't carry weapons unless they're what? In the military. Blacks can't marry whites. That actually lasted like 1965, folks. That law. So like 50 years ago. Blacks required a white guardian. To like give them tips, advice.
Like those guys.
Blacks required a white guardian. Blacks not working would be forced to work. Blacks not working would be forced to work because we can't have them just like loitering around and be poor. We have to help them find jobs. So blacks not working would be forced. And lastly, blacks can't quit their jobs without just cause. Blacks can't quit their jobs without just cause or without good reason. These sound a lot like what? These sound a lot like the slave codes. But they're not slaves. They're free. They're free now. So like, hey, free guys, you can't be out at night. Not because you might run away, but it's dangerous out there. And you're going to have a white guardian because you're new to democracy and we're going to have to watch over you guys. But folks, what are they pretty much trying to do? Trying to make them like slaves, right? Without calling us. It's like, these are like the slaves, but they're not slaves. I mean, come on.
13th Amendment, hello, not slaves. We're just trying to help them along, trying to give them what they need. But folks, these black codes were designed to control the blacks, right? That was the whole purpose. Pretty much, the purpose was to create a virtual slave system. They're not slaves, but are we going to kind of treat them like one? As much as we can, we're going to treat them like slaves. Without breaking the law, we're going to treat them like slaves. Well, folks, they're being treated like slaves politically. Economically, most former slaves or freedmen had no choice but to become sharecroppers or tenant farmers. Because, folks, are there a lot of factories in the South? No. So what's the only job they could probably have once they're free? Work on farms. So many of these black freedmen become sharecroppers or tenant farmers. And what sharecropping and tenant farming was freedmen they would rent land from former masters. So pretty much they were working for their former masters, and they say, hey, I as a master will lend you land, seeds, I'll give you food for a time being. In fact, I'll even give you a house to live in for a little while. You can live on my land. But you're going to pay rent. Okay? And at the end of the harvest, I expect you to pay me 70% of your harvest. Hey, rent. Okay? You're going to pay me 70% of your harvest at the end of the season. So you're like, well, I really don't have any choice. Okay, fine. I'm going to pay you 70% of my harvest. You shake on it. Good. At the end of the year, you have your harvest and you realize, look, man, I know I said I'd give you 70%, but I can't survive on only 30%. I need at least 40%. So the guy's like, oh, well, okay, that's fine. Just give me 60% this year and you'll just owe me 10% next year. Okay. So the following year, how much do you owe him? 80%. They say, okay, well, time's come, you owe me 80% this year, but I'm sorry, I just didn't grow enough this year. Can I pay you next year? Oh, yeah, sure. Just owe me another 10% next year. And then 90%. And then 100%. And eventually, folks, are you ever going to be able to pay him back? No. Now, here's the thing, folks. He's not a slave. So these people can leave any time that they want, so long as they pay off their debts. Say, you can leave whenever you want, but you have to pay me back first. So, I mean, you're free. You are free to go, but you still owe me money. So you can't. I mean, you just can't leave, and you owe me like 100% of your crops this year. So until you pay me back, I can't. We signed a contract, man. You can't just go. And so, could these men leave their farms? No. But it's not slavery. It's not, because they can leave whenever they want. But it is kind of slavery. It's debt slavery. You can't pay off your debt. You can't leave until you pay off your debt. This is typically the slavery that's engaged today in America, folks. Or not America, in like Pakistan or other countries, where you sell your child because you owe money. And so your child's going to work to like make soccer balls for a living. But because your child is living in a room and being fed, they're going to deduct those wages out of the child's money that they're making. It's like, hey, well, you know what? You can send that $3 back to your family this year, but you actually incurred $5. So you can't leave until you pay off that extra $5. So they can't leave until they pay off their money. Huh? Not yet. They can't vote yet either. So, folks, sharecropping. Is this like virtual slavery? Yes, this is, again, virtual slavery. But it's not slavery, folks. But here's a pop quiz. There are two pictures here. Which one is sharecropping and which one is slavery? Well, this one is slavery, and this one is sharecropping. But the point being made is what? They look about the same. I mean, it looks like the exact same thing has happened. And the North felt the same way. So
if you look, were a lot of people sharecropping. Quite a bit. Sharecropping spread throughout the South because there weren't very many options. And so the North finally asked, wait a minute. Wait, who won the Civil War? I thought that the North won the Civil War. But when I go and visit the South, what does it look like? It looks like slavery remained. And so the North was very upset. They asked, wait, who won the Civil War? Because when you go to the South, it looks like the slave system is alive and well. So did something have to be done? He said, this is not good enough. Reconstruction is not working. We have to make this better. So they began radical Reconstruction. They said, we have to change this. This is not good enough. Not enough change is happening. Just ending slavery? No. We have to do more for them. We have to do more. And so Congress began radical Reconstruction. And Congress was able to do this because, again, Congress controlled the radical Republicans controlled 2/3 of both houses, which means if Andrew Johnson wanted to veto anything, what could Congress do?
Override it.
Just override the veto, because all you need to override, not all you need, it's very hard to do, but if you have 2/3 of both houses vote against the veto, it still automatically becomes law, because Congress can override a president's veto if they want to. Well, in any case, folks, here's what they do. First off, they create what is known as the Freedmen's Bureau. The Freedmen's Bureau is designed to help who? The freedmen. They would provide them, or they would help them find food, shelter, clothes, jobs, land, their families. I mean, they're a very good organization to help those in need. The Freedmen's Bureau was designed to help these people. In fact, one of the most important things that they did was what? It's not listed here. What's one of the most important things that the Freedmen's Bureau did for the South? What did the blacks absolutely need that was not being provided for them yet? An education. They educated them. In fact, folks, it wasn't just freedmen that they educated. They also educated poor whites. And by far, folks, this is the greatest contribution of the Freedmen's Bureau, education. You'll have this question on your test. They'll ask you, what was the greatest contribution of the Freedmen's Bureau? Education. Not the land, the food, the shelter. That's all good. But education is that long-lasting. So education is the most important, educating both poor whites and blacks. Education. Now, Johnson tried to veto this. What did Congress do? They overrode the veto. So Johnson vetoed it. Congress said, nope, we're going to do it. Too bad, Johnson, you suck. So here are some pictures of Freedmen's School. Again, most of the teachers were white women from the North. Why not black? Why not white women from the South? Because they're racists. Most were. Some were not, but most were. Here's another Freedmen's School. Also tried to pass something called the Civil Rights Act of 1866. And the whole point of the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was to protect black civil rights. And in particular, folks, what were they trying to protect it from? What was taking away black civil rights in the South? The black codes. So they're trying to protect them from the black codes because they were taking away their rights, right to be out at night, all those things. They said, no, you can't do that. So the Civil Rights Act of 1866 was supposed to protect black civil rights from things like the black codes, trying to eliminate that. Yes? If they, who broke the black codes? Blacks? They might go to jail, that kind of stuff. They would go to prison, that kind of stuff. So they try to protect black civil rights. Johnson vetoed this as well, and what did Congress do? They overrode the veto. They're getting pretty upset with Johnson here. And so Congress says, you know what else we're going to do? We're going to turn the Civil Rights Act into the 14th Amendment. And so, not just being a law, instead what Congress decided was to pass the 14th Amendment, which gave blacks civil rights. So it's not just freeing the blacks anymore. It's also giving them civil rights and citizenship. Civil rights and citizenship. All of you benefit from this, because citizenship cannot be denied to a natural-born American or naturalized American, regardless of race, creed, ethnicity, condition of servitude. Otherwise, even if you came to America legally, you still might not be given, or even if you were born here, without the 14th Amendment, it's possible that we all would be denied citizenship because we're not white. So, 14th Amendment changes all of that. Then the military reconstruction begins. They say, you know what? The South really needs to accept these, because if not, then what's the point? So they begin military reconstruction, and the goal is to force the South to accept the 13th and 14th Amendment. The goal of military reconstruction is to force the South to accept the 13th and 14th Amendment. And if they didn't, they wouldn't allow them to return to the Union. They wouldn't let them return to the Union. And by the way, what they did, folks, is instead of making them states, they divided them into districts ruled by the military, saying, hey, if you don't do what we say, you'll never become a state. You'll just be part of District 5. So if you want to be a state again, they wouldn't allow them to vote or anything until they accepted the 13th or 14th Amendment. Or they wouldn't allow them to return to the Union. Then came the 15th Amendment. And in 1869, what else do we still have to give blacks? The right to vote. So the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendment, folks, these are known as the Reconstruction Amendments. 13th Amendment, what did it do? Freed the slaves. What did the 14th Amendment do? Give blacks civil rights. What did the 15th Amendment do? Right to vote. This gave black men the right to vote. Who's really upset about this, by the way? Women are really like, whoa, 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 whoa. We sacrificed our suffrage movement to free you, and now you're giving blacks the right to vote for it? That is not okay. And women were upset. No, but I thought it would have been really funny, though, if it just said all blacks could vote. So black women could vote, but white women could not. Hey, whoa, that is not okay. Well, technically they have the right to vote because of the way the law was written. I thought it would have been funny and hilarious if that happened, but it did not. So, history is not as funny as I want it to be. Okay, last thing. So Congress hates Johnson. So they decide to pass what is known as a Tenure of Office Act.
So why did he veto everything?
Because he agreed with Lincoln.
Oh.
He wanted slow Reconstruction. Johnson was not happy with what was happening in the South. He's a Democrat also. He's a Southern Democrat. And he's not happy. All he wanted was return the Union. He didn't want to end slavery.
Oh.
And so Congress decides to pass the Tenure of Office Act. It's a good question, though. They decided to pass the Tenure of Office Act. And what the law said is that the president may not remove the Secretary of War. The president, who is a Democrat, may not remove the Secretary of War, who is a Republican, without congressional approval. So again, the president may not remove the Secretary of War, who is a Republican, without congressional approval. Remember, does Johnson like the Republicans? Hates them. And why might he want to remove the Secretary of War? What's the Secretary of War responsible for at this time? The military, and therefore he's responsible for what? Military Reconstruction. So he wants to remove him and put a Democrat in charge. Well, Johnson removes him anyway, because he says, this law is stupid, it's unconstitutional. Gets impeached. Folks, what is impeachment? You're fired, right? Wrong. I know, you guys think impeachment means to be removed from office, but that's not what it means. Impeachment is a two-step process, folks. All you need to know is impeachment means you're investigated. If there's enough evidence, there's a trial, and then you get removed from office. You don't have to write all this down. But just know that the impeachment process is 2 steps. First is the impeachment. Second is the trial. If they find you guilty in the trial, do they then remove you from office? Yes. But you can be impeached without being removed from office. Does that make sense? President Clinton was impeached. Was he removed from office? No. Johnson was impeached. He was not removed, but saved by only 7 votes. Almost impeached. We'll stop here today, folks, because we'll talk about... Here he is, by the way. Look how unhappy he is. He is not happy. We'll discuss Southern Reconstruction and end this unit on Monday, folks. Wait for the bell. I'll see you guys later.